Hi guys, welcome back to Storytime with Miss Porter. We are going to continue with Louisiana's Way Home. Today we are going to read chapter 24 and 25. I hope you enjoy. Alright, chapter 24. I woke up in Reverend Obertask's office. I was on the floor, and my head was on a pillow made out of a scratchy tweed jacket. Reverend Obertask was sitting at his desk, staring down at me. "Ah," he said, "there you are." "Here I am," I said. "You fainted." The sun was shining in through Reverend Obertask's window and landing right on his head so that he looked like a walrus in a religious painting. Not that I had ever seen a walrus in a religious painting. Camels, yes, and also horses, and sometimes dogs. And angels, of course. There are always angels in religious paintings. You don't see that many angels in real life, though. Reverend Obertask smiled at me. "Mourners faint at funerals," he said. "It's a common occurrence. But you are the first musician I've ever known to faint mid-song. Miss Lulu is supremely agitated, of course. She likes for things to go a certain way, a predictable way." Well, I understood that feeling. Not that I have ever experienced things going a predictable way. I closed my eyes. I saw Granny smiling with all her teeth. I saw Mrs. Ivy waving the bill. I saw Dr. Fox in his bloody jacket. And then I saw Clarence's wings, dark and shiny, beating out to the rhythm of a heart. I opened my eyes and looked at Reverend Obertask. Was there a crow in church? Not to my knowledge. "Oh," I said. "What about a dentist? Did you see a dentist?" "I did not," said Reverend Obertask. "Although I must say that they are a little more difficult to identify at a glance. Did you see anyone wearing a fur coat?" "No crows, no dentists, no fur coats," said Reverend Obertask. He smiled at me again. I said, "I don't know who I am. I only know that I am not who I thought I was." Reverend Obertask nodded his big head. "That is a problem we all face sooner or later, I suppose." From out in the church there came a crashing sound of Miss Lulu on the organ. Reverend Obertask stood up. "Clearly Miss Lulu is becoming impatient," he said. "There is still her funeral to run. Why don't you rest? I'll drive you home when this is all over. We can talk things through." I closed my eyes. Reverend Obertask the walrus was going to drive me home. I wondered where that was, home. "Provisions have been made." That is what the granny, Mirage, had said to me, or that was what I had heard. And then, before I knew it, I was asleep, because I was just so very, very tired. Reverend Obertask took me to the Allens' house. You could smell the cake baking when we were still out in the woods, before the pink house even came to view. Reverend Obertask knocked on the back door, and Betty Allen opened it and said, "What in the world?" She opened her arms to me, and I walked right into them. Betty Allen held me tight for a minute, and then she let me go. "There was a little mishap at the funeral," said Reverend Obertask. "My, but it smells wonderful in here." Betty Allen blushed. "I am the official baker for the carnival," she said. "Yes, indeed," said Reverend Obertask. "That is why it's called the world-famous Betty Allen cake raffle. What particular cake am I smelling now?" "That is my pound cake," said Betty Allen. "It's not a fancy cake, but it's very, very good. It's my great-grandmother's recipe." "It smells divine," said Reverend Obertask. I would like to win a pound cake in the world-famous Betty Allen cake raffle," I said. "Oh, honey," said Betty Allen. "How would you feel about Mrs. Allen and myself having a private word?" said Reverend Obertask to me. "Burke should be home from school any minute now," said Betty Allen. "You could wait for him outside." I went out the back door and stood in the carport and listened to Reverend Obertask say, "I am very worried about this child." And Betty Allen said back to him, "I am worried too." I could tell that the conversation between Reverend Obertask and Betty Allen was going to be extremely sad, and I just didn't think my heart could bear to listen. I walked away from them, down to the end of the driveway. I stood and looked out at the woods. I whistled for Clarence the same way Bert did. 2 low whistles and then one high one. But Clarence didn't come. I sat down on the ground. On the drive back from the funeral, I had told Reverend Overtask my story, or most of my story. I did not tell him that Granny was gone, because I did not want Reverend Overtask to contact the authorities. In any case, I started with Elf Ear, Nebraska, and the stage and the sundering that occurred there. I told him about the letter from the fake Granny, and how it told the story of a magician walking away from his daughter without saying anything to her at all. And also the story of the Louisiana 5 and dime, and the dark alley, and the flowered blanket, and what was inside it, which was me. I told him about Dr. Fox pulling every last one of Granny's teeth, and me lying to Mrs. Ivy about the bill. I told him about the Good Night Sleep Tight, and how it had a vending machine in the vestibule with everything you could ever want inside of it, and also how there was a stuffed alligator in the lobby who was very ferocious looking. I told him that there had been curtains with palm trees all over them in room 102, and how it was wrong for palm trees to be on curtains in Georgia. I told him that Bernice was holding my suitcase for ransom, and that I would probably never see it again. I told him how I had asked Burke Allen for 1 bologna sandwich, and he had given me 2. I told him that Betty Allen was making 17 cakes. 17! And that the grandfather Burke Allen had given me his bowl of ice cream with chocolate sauce and peanuts on top of it, and that he had held my hand while I ate it. I told him about Beverly and Ramey. I told him about Buddy, the one-eyed dog, and how the 3 of us had rescued him together. I told him about Archie, king of the cats, and how once he had found his way back to me. I told him about the time I almost drowned, and that the blue fairy had shown up underwater, smiling at me and holding out her arms, and that part of me wanted to go with her, deeper into the pond. I told him that the operator on the phone in his office had told me that there were no listings for Topinski, and too many listings for Clark with an E, and no Ramey Clark at all, and how could that be? And speaking of how things could be, I asked him again how anybody could leave a baby in an alley. How could that be? How could it? Reverend Overtask stared straight ahead at the road the whole time I was talking. And here was the surprising thing. He cried. I talked, and he kept his eyes on the road, and I watched one tear and then another tear creep down his sad walrus face and disappear into his whiskers. When we got to the Good Night Sleep Tight, I said to Reverend Overtask, I want to get my suitcase back from Bernice, and I want to go to the Allens' house because Granny is still unwell and needs to sleep a healing sleep. Reverend Overtask said, Please wait here, Louisiana. He went into the motel office, and a few minutes later, he came walking out with my suitcase. The suitcase looked very small in his big hand. When he got back into the car, Reverend Overtask turned to me and said, I want you to know something, Louisiana. We all, at some point, have to decide who we want to be in this world. It is a decision we make for ourselves. You are being forced to make this decision at an early age, but that does not mean that you cannot do it well and wisely. I believe you can. I have great faith in you. You decide. You decide who you are, Louisiana. Do you understand? I told him that I did understand, even though I wasn't certain that I did. And another thing, he said, you will never understand why your parents left you in that alley. It is impossible to understand, but it may be necessary for you to forgive them, for your own sake, without ever truly understanding what they did. Okay? His face was so serious and sad that I said, Yes, Reverend Overtask, I understand. But I didn't understand. How could I forgive people who had never shown me any kindness? How could I forgive people who had left me behind without loving me at all? And so it came to pass that I found myself sitting at the end of a long driveway in front of a pink house that smelled like cake, thinking about forgiveness and who I wanted to be in this world. Chapter 25. I sat there until Burke Allen came walking out of the woods with Clarence sitting on his shoulder. Hey, said Burke. Hey, Louisiana. Guess what? I got the whole thing planned out. I know just where to go and what bus to get on and the whole thing. And just as he said that, I heard Reverend Overtask say my name. Louisiana, he said. I turned and looked behind me, and lo and behold, I saw the walrus and the blue fairy standing together at the top of the driveway. And even though Pinocchio does not encounter a walrus on his journey, Reverend Obertask and Betty Allen standing there together looked like something out of Pinocchio's story come to life. Reverend Obertask waved at me, and then he came walking down the driveway and took hold of my hand. He said, "Thank you for talking with me, Louisiana." I said, "You are welcome." And then Betty Allen said my name. "Louisiana Elefante," she called out my name. "I wonder if you would like to come and help me bake the last cake, which is a marble cake." "Me?" I said. "Yes, you, honey." "Is a marble cake a cake with surprise marbles in it?" I said. "There's a recipe," said Betty Allen. "The two of us will follow it together." "Why don't you go on up there and help her?" said Reverend Obertask. "I'll get your suitcase out of the car." Clarence flapped his wings and took off from Burke's shoulder and flew away. Reverend Obertask let go of my hand. "Go on, Louisiana," said Burke. "I'll wait on you." The kitchen in the pink house was painted a bright yellow, and being in that room with Betty Allen was like standing inside of the sun. What I am going to have you do is measure out the flour and the baking powder and the salt, and all the dry ingredients, basically, said Betty Allen. I said, "I've never made any kind of cake before." "Never ever?" said Betty Allen. "No," I said. "My granny does not believe in baking." Betty Allen put her hands on her hips. "Well, for heaven's sake, what does she believe in?" That was a good question. I considered it. "Singing," I said finally. "She believes in me singing." Betty Allen nodded. "Reverend Obertask did say that you have a beautiful voice. Now, here is the flour and the salt and what have you, and also a few bowls and measuring cups and spoons, and I will just put you to work on this counter over here." I measured the flour and the salt and the baking powder, and the whole time Betty Allen was standing at the counter opposite me, humming under her breath. It was warm in the kitchen, and the yellow walls were so bright, and Betty Allen's humming was so musical that I started to think that maybe things weren't as tragic as they seemed. Betty Allen said, "Maybe when we have baked this cake, we will take a big old piece of it to your granny at the good night sleep tight." "That is not at all necessary," I said, very, very quickly. "Your granny doesn't like cake?" said Betty Allen. "Her teeth hurt too much to eat," I said. "It's very difficult to eat cake when you are toothless. The world in general becomes a difficult place without teeth." "Oh," said Betty Allen, "I see." She went back to humming. We put everything together into one big bowl, the wet ingredients and the dry ingredients, and mixed it all together with the electric mixer, and then poured half of it into a cake pan. "There," said Betty Allen. "Now we will add the cocoa to the rest of the batter and swirl it all around. That's the marbling part. Maybe you want to do that?" She stood over me. She put her hands on my shoulders and said, "Just pour it on there and swirl." I poured. I swirled. "That's right," said Betty Allen. "Make it as swirly as you want." When I was done, Betty Allen kept her hands on my shoulders, and we both stared together down at the cake. She said, "Louisiana, you can trust me. You can tell me the truth. Is your granny gone?" I didn't answer her. I couldn't answer her. I also couldn't keep myself from crying. And once I started crying, I couldn't stop. I stood there in the yellow kitchen in the pink house, and I cried and cried. I cried because Granny was truly and forever gone, and somehow I knew that she was not coming back. I cried because I was alone. I cried because the curse was not my curse. I cried, and my tears of sadness and despair and hope and anger fell directly into the marble cake that had no marbles. Betty Allen said, "We would be happy to help you try to find your granny, honey, but you can stay with us for as long as you need to. You can have a home with us if that's what you want." It was such a simple sentence. Why did it sound so beautiful and impossible? "Think about it," said Betty Allen. "I know Emma Stonehill over in Family Services. I could talk to her. Reverend Obertask could talk to her, too. We could find a way to make it work, honey." She picked up the cake pan and turned away from me and opened the oven door. And when the marble cake was inside the oven and the door was closed, Betty Allen clasped her hands together as if she had just performed a magic trick. "Now," she said, "run on out there and look for Burke. I know he's waiting on you. And, honey, we would all love to have you stay here with us and be a part of our family, but it's your decision entirely." It was my decision, entirely. I went outside, and Burke was there. He looked at me, and my goodness, his eyes were bright, and it occurred to me that they were probably so bright because he had never had to ask himself who he was, or where he belonged, or who he wanted to be. He was Burke Allen, who was the son of Burke Allen, who was the son of Burke Allen, and on, indefinitely. "Do you still want to go to Florida?" said Burke. "I don't know," I told him. "I don't know what I want to do." He nodded. He whistled for Clarence. And then Burke said, "Come on and follow me." Now that we've read chapters 24 and 25, in the discussion below, I want you to write about what you think. You're going to be making a prediction. So, do you think Louisiana will decide to stay with the Allens? And then, depending yes or no on what you think, I want you to predict what's going to happen at the end of the story.